It was supposed to be just another taping, another episode filled with music, light banter, and a few clever sketches that poked fun at the times. But what came next never made it to air. A 5-minute segment, simple in presentation, but nuclear in impact, detonated a crisis that would forever change the face of American television. At its center stood David Steinberg, a comedian known for pushing limits, but this time, his satire wasn't just sharp, it was revolutionary. Standing behind a lectern styled to resemble a church pulpit, he delivered what would be dubbed the forbidden sermon. What started as a biblical retelling of Moses' defiance swiftly morphed into a scathing commentary on war, power, and presidential authority. Moses looked straight at Pharaoh, "Sorry, Mr. President," and said, "Take your army and go. I will not help you any longer." It was no longer just comedy. It was protest, defiance, a cry from the screen that dared to challenge the establishment. Within minutes of receiving the tape, CBS executives went into a tailspin. Panic spread through corporate hallways as phones lit up and urgent meetings were convened. This wasn't a minor line they could snip or a joke they could tone down. This was a message clear, deliberate, and timed to strike a nerve in a nation already torn apart by the Vietnam War. For CBS, the segment wasn't just controversial. It was dangerous. Dangerous to their sponsors, dangerous to their reputation, and most of all, dangerous to the fragile balance they maintained between creative liberty and political appeasement. Before the segment could ever meet the public, the network took action. The episode was pulled, silenced, locked away. But silence, as they would soon learn, carries its own sound. A roaring backlash erupted the moment the cancellation became known. College students, once passive viewers, became vocal defenders. Bootleg copies of the banned episode circulated like forbidden texts. Letters flooded in, some furious, others fearful. The media, once indifferent to variety show antics, began probing deeper. What was CBS so afraid of? Why did a few lines of satire provoke such extreme censorship? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, if this could be silenced, what else already had? This wasn't just about a comedy sketch anymore. It was a referendum on free speech, a televised line in the sand between art and authority. And though the show was abruptly cut, the shockwaves it created would echo through the industry for decades to come. For the Smothers brothers, it marked the beginning of their exile. For CBS, it was a desperate attempt to reassert control. But for America, it was a reckoning one that exposed the cost of truth-telling in prime time. To understand how such a simple moment led to such explosive consequences, we need to go back to when it all began. To the rise of two brothers, whose charm disguised a quiet defiance, and whose comedy show would become the most unlikely battlefield in the war for free expression. Long before they became lightning rods for controversy, Tom and Dick Smothers were just two brothers with guitars, a sense of rhythm, and a knack for charming a crowd. Raised in a strict military household and shaped by a blend of discipline and creativity, they found early solace in music. But their performances were never just about melody. Beneath the harmonies was a unique comedic chemistry. Tom's naive, bumbling persona clashing with Dick's straight-man routine. It was unorthodox, it was unpredictable, and it was unlike anything the American stage had seen. At first, they toured small clubs and college campuses, playing folk tunes with a comic twist. But with every performance, it became clearer. They weren't just musicians who could joke, they were comedians disguised as musicians. And soon, Hollywood took notice. What followed was an unlikely leap. From college venues to national television, the brothers brought their act to mainstream America. They started with guest appearances, small parts, and hosting gigs that tested the waters. Their charm was undeniable. CBS executives, eager to shake up their aging Sunday night lineup, made a gamble. In 1967, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was born. On the surface, it looked like any other variety show of its time: bright lights, musical guests, and slapstick bits. But beneath that polished exterior was something volatile, something no one at the network had anticipated. The formula seemed harmless at first. There were folk performances, light sketches, and brotherly banter that felt safe enough for family viewing. But Tom Smothers wasn't interested in just entertaining. He wanted to say something, While Dick maintained the balance with well-timed punchlines and affable restraint, Tom began nudging the material closer to the edge. Each week, jokes became just a little sharper. Lines began hinting at the absurdity of war, the hypocrisy of politics, the rigidity of societal norms. It was subtle at first, just enough to slide past the censors, but unmistakable to viewers who were paying attention. The audience responded. Young viewers, particularly those swept up in the rising tide of counterculture, saw something in the Smothers brothers they didn't see anywhere else on TV, truth buried in humor. College campuses lit up with quotes from their sketches. Their jokes were no longer just funny, they were relevant, and that made them dangerous. As ratings climbed, so did the stakes. The network saw the numbers, but also the risks. Letters from concerned viewers began to pile up. Southern affiliates complained, but CBS held the line, at least for the moment. Because even then, in its infancy, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was revealing its true nature. It wasn't just a show, it was a fuse, already lit, inching toward an explosion. And that explosion would come not in the form of a joke gone too far, but through a show that dared to evolve from entertainment into activism. As the brothers leaned further into their purpose, the boundaries of primetime television would begin to stretch, strain, and ultimately shatter. By the late 1960s, America was a nation cracking at its seams. Vietnam raged on. Civil rights protests surged through the streets, and the youth, disillusioned by the promises of their elders, were no longer willing to stay silent. It was in this climate of unrest that the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour found its pulse. What had started as a harmless variety show began transforming into something far more volatile. Week after week, behind the jokes and jingles, something was shifting. Tom Smothers, once seen as the funny brother, started pushing a different agenda, one that questioned authority, mocked hypocrisy, and laid bare the contradictions of the American dream. The turning point came not with a grand announcement, but with a subtle infiltration of satire. What began as witty asides soon evolved into biting commentary. The humor was still there, but now it carried weight. The jokes weren't just about family or relationships, they were about the draft, the police, the government. When folk legend, Pete Seeger was booked to perform Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a song that criticized blind obedience and hinted at the futility of war, CBS tried to block the segment. Tom fought back. The song aired. And just like that, the audience knew this show wasn't playing by the old rules anymore. From there, the guest list became a lightning rod. Joan Baez sang for her imprisoned husband, who had refused military service. Jefferson Airplane belted out psychedelic anthems that flirted with rebellion. The Who smashed their instruments on stage in a performance so chaotic it took down the sound system. But these weren't just performances. They were protests wrapped in music, statements wrapped in rhythm. Every guest carried with them a message, and every week, the airwaves carried it into the living rooms of unsuspecting families. Viewers either leaned in or recoiled, but no one could ignore it. And then there were the writers. Steve Martin, long before he became a household name, was in that room penning segments that dripped with irony and defiance. Pat Paulson, the show's satirical presidential candidate, delivered absurd speeches that parodied real politics so closely that some audiences couldn't tell where the joke ended and the truth began. These sketches, absurd and brilliant, cut deeper than the nightly news. They mocked power, exposed doublespeak, and held up a mirror to a society teetering on the edge. But while the youth celebrated this audacity, CBS felt the heat. The censors weren't laughing. Each week became a battle, scripts scrutinized, segments trimmed, guests questioned. Executives began issuing ultimatums, demanding edits that diluted the very message the show had come to stand for. But Tom Smothers refused to back down. Every line became a line in the sand. Every joke was a gamble. The conflict was no longer hidden behind studio doors. It was playing out in real time on live television. The stakes were rising. And as the EE show grew bolder, CBS grew more desperate to rein it in. But the brothers had already chosen their side. They weren't just hosting a variety show anymore. They were leading a cultural insurgency. And that insurgency was about to bring them face to face with the full force of the network's power. What the public saw was laughter, music, and mischief. But behind the curtains, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had become a war zone. CBS was no longer amused. The subtle satire that once slipped under the radar had evolved into full-blown defiance. Every week, new material landed on the desks of CBS executives, and with it came dread. Sketches about the Vietnam War, songs about prison resistance, jokes that dared to mock presidents and pastors alike. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was political dynamite, and CBS was standing too close to the blast zone. Executives, now cornered by sponsor threats and affiliate backlash, responded the only way they knew how: control. Policies were rewritten. The once generous production window shrank under new mandates. Every episode now had to be submitted 10 days in advance, every line reviewed, every segment pre-approved, and every guest vetted with surgical scrutiny. What had once been a stage for experimentation became a maze of red tape. Writers were told to water down the punchlines. Performers were warned against overt messaging. But what CBS hadn't anticipated was that the Smothers Brothers, especially Tom, were not just comedians, they were crusaders now. Tom Smothers refused to fold. Instead of submitting early, he began sending episodes late, cutting deadlines razor thin, so the network wouldn't have time to censor the heart of the show. Segments flagged for removal were sometimes swapped in last minute. Scenes they wanted gone were masked inside other skits, camouflaged to slip past editorial eyes. It became a game of cat and mouse, only the cat was a billion-dollar network, and the mouse was armed with wit, conviction, and just enough public favor to stay dangerous. But every risk had its cost. In several cases, CBS simply cut scenes altogether. Joan Baez's explanation for her husband's incarceration was erased. Certain lines in musical performances were bleeped or removed entirely. One week, a full segment vanished just hours before, airtime leaving viewers and the cast in equal confusion. These weren't minor edits. They were deliberate attempts to reshape the narrative, to dull the sharp edges of the show's message. Yet even in the face of this silencing, Tom doubled down. His belief was unshakable. If they surrendered now, the fight for creative integrity would be over. Dick, ever the steady counterpart, urged caution. But even he knew they had passed the point of compromise. The tone in production meetings turned cold. CBS executives stopped offering suggestions and began issuing warnings. Future episodes were to remain apolitical. Guests seen as incendiary were blacklisted. One executive bluntly told Tom, "You're making it impossible for us to protect you." But Tom didn't want protection. He wanted a platform. And if CBS was going to burn it down, they'd have to do it with the whole country watching. That final act of defiance would come sooner than anyone expected. A segment was produced. A line was crossed. And this time, no trickery or delay could stop what was about to unfold. Because the next episode wasn't just another jab, it was a directly strike. And the moment it landed, it would silence the show forever. It was supposed to be just another punchline, wrapped in satire, delivered with a smirk. But the moment David Steinberg stepped up to the pulpit for his now infamous sermonette, it became clear that this wasn't comedy, it was confrontation. He stood there dressed as a rabbi, calm and deliberate. And what followed wasn't blasphemy in the traditional sense. It was something far more threatening, truth cloaked in humor. In under 5 minutes, Steinberg bridged the biblical with the political, transforming Moses into a modern-day anti-war figure and Pharaoh into a thinly veiled stand-in for President Nixon. The line that shattered the silence wasn't shouted, but it echoed louder than any explosion. Moses looked straight at Pharaoh, "Sorry, Mr. President," and said, "Take your army and go. I will not help you any longer." With that one phrase, the veil was lifted, and CBS's tolerance snapped. The moment the tape landed in CBS's hands, panic followed. This wasn't just another skit they could quietly trim. This was a direct hit on the administration, a challenge to the very institutions the network was desperate not to offend. Executives didn't debate, they didn't edit, they shut it down. Cold. The episode was blocked, flagged as a violation of review protocol, and pulled from the schedule. No warning, no discussion, just silence. For CBS, this was self-preservation. For Tom Smothers, it was betrayal. He had pushed the limits before, But never had they reacted this swiftly, this decisively. Tom claimed the tape had been delivered on time. The delay, he said, was no accident. It was sabotage. CBS, he argued, had wanted an excuse, and now they had it. He refused to recut the segment. He refused to apologize. Dick, ever the mediator, tried to keep things from collapsing. But even he knew this was the moment they had all feared. The moment when art and authority could no longer coexist. The fallout was immediate. Word spread like wildfire. Though the ID episode never aired in the U.S., bootleg copies started surfacing on college campuses and among activist groups. VHS tapes were passed hand to hand like forbidden relics. Newspapers dissected every word of the banned sermon. Some called it treasonous, others prophetic. But the division was clear. One side saw it as a threat, the other as a revelation. And while CBS remained silent, the public grew louder. Students protested outside local affiliates. Critics penned furious op-eds. The conversation had changed. This wasn't just about one show or one sketch. This was about who controlled the airwaves. This was about whether the truth could survive in prime time. With the episode erased and the sermon silenced, the message was unmistakable. The network had chosen the safe path. The brothers had chosen defiance. And now, the fuse they lit was about to consume everything in its path. The cancellation of the episode was no longer just a reaction, it was a warning shot. And what came next would finish the war that had started with a whisper from a pulpit. The decision came down swiftly, quietly, but with the weight of finality. On April 4, 1969, CBS officially terminated the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. No press release, no public statement. Just a new show, Hee Haw, filling their time slot the following week. In the end, it wasn't a scandal or a ratings collapse that brought them down. It was a sermon, a sketch, a single breath of defiance wrapped in satire. That was all it took. And just like that, one of the boldest, most controversial voices in television was gone. Cancelled not because it failed, but because it succeeded in saying too much. But Tom and Dick didn't go quietly. What followed was not just outrage, but a battle. Behind the scenes, their team prepared a lawsuit that would become a landmark in entertainment history. They accused CBS of breach of contract, arguing that the cancellation was not due to a production violation, but because the network could no longer handle the political heat. CBS, of course, denied it. They insisted it was about missed deadlines and protocol, but when the case finally went to court, the truth began to bleed through. In 1973, after 4 years of legal warfare, the court ruled in the brothers' favor. CBS was ordered to pay over $770,000. It was a symbolic victory, but one that came too late to revive what they had lost. Professionally, the damage was already done. Tom Smothers, once seen as a fresh face in comedy, was now labeled as a threat. Networks wouldn't touch him. Offers disappeared. He had become radioactive. Even Dick, the quieter, more conciliatory brother, found doors closing. Their faces, once weekly staples in American households, vanished from primetime screens. What they had fought for had made them unhireable. And yet, that silence only amplified the myth. The Smothers Brothers hadn't just been cancelled. They had been exiled. But exile has a strange way of solidifying legacy. As the 1970s progressed, a new wave of television creators began to rise, men like Lorne Michaels, who would go on to create Saturday Night Live. These were producers who grew up watching the Smothers Brothers. They had witnessed the price of speaking out. And now, they carried that spirit forward. Sketch comedy evolved. Satire sharpened. Programs like SNL and The Daily Show owed their DNA to what Tom and Dick had started and suffered for. Even off the air, their story sparked broader debates. Newspaper editorials invoked the Smothers Brothers when arguing for creative freedom. University lectures analyzed their cancellation as a case study in media censorship. They became more than performers. They became a symbol. A symbol of what happens when truth makes people uncomfortable, when art collides with politics, when laughter dares to challenge power. And while their voices had been silenced, the echo remained. The stage lights may have dimmed, but the questions they raised about freedom of expression and the limits of television had only just begun to spread. The end of the show wasn't the end of its influence. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Because what they had created refused to fade. It lived on, waiting to be rediscovered and reinterpreted by the next generation of rebels with something to say. They may have been pulled off the air, but the Smothers Brothers were never truly silenced. Their voices, sharp, comedic, and unapologetically political, continued to reverberate long after the cameras stopped rolling. What they created wasn't just a show, it was a blueprint, a template for how satire could cut through the noise, how comedy could be weaponized not for cruelty, but for clarity. In the years that followed, television began to change, but it never forgot. And at the center of that shift stood two brothers who had dared to speak while others played it safe. It didn't take long for their influence to show. When Saturday Night Live debuted in 1975, its DNA bore unmistakable traces of the Smothers Brothers' rebellion. Lorne Michaels, SNL's creator, had grown up watching Tom and Dick push the boundaries of what television could be. The political jabs, the musical protests, the irreverent skits that walked the line between truth and taboo. It was all there, resurrected for a new generation. Decades later, The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight, and other satirical powerhouses would follow the same path. Carving out their space in a media world the Smothers Brothers helped unshackle. Every time a comedian stood on stage and turned politics into punchlines, it was a quiet nod to what Tom and Dick started. Recognition came slowly, but it came. In 2008, nearly 40 years after they were blacklisted, Tom Smothers accepted an honorary Emmy. With tears in his eyes and defiance still in his voice, he stood before the very industry that had once turned its back on him. His speech was simple, powerful, unforgettable. Freedom of expression is the foundation of democracy, and it is often paid for with silence. The crowd rose to its feet, and in that moment, history corrected itself. In 2010, the brothers were inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame, not as performers alone, but as pioneers who had dared to use comedy as a mirror to power. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, their legacy was being preserved. The entire archive of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, including unaired scripts, censored footage, and handwritten notes, was transferred to the University of California, Santa Barbara. For the first time, researchers, students, and historians could study what CBS had once tried to bury. And what they found was astonishing. Sketches that had been rejected as too radical in 1968 now read like brilliant, scathing critiques of systemic failure. The laughter they evoked wasn't just entertainment, it was resistance. Even today, the show's themes feel hauntingly familiar. War, injustice, political hypocrisy, the battle between truth and media. The very things the Smothers Brothers confronted still dominate our headlines. And that's the tragedy and the triumph of their story. They were ahead of their time, and somehow, still right on time. The jokes they told, the songs they sang, the risks they took, they all remind us that comedy isn't just about getting laughs. It's about starting fires. And the one they started, it never went out. Because the story of the Smothers Brothers doesn't end with cancellation. It continues every time someone refuses to stay quiet. Every time laughter dares to tell the truth. The world may look different now, faster, louder, more connected than ever. But the fight that the Smothers Brothers once waged is still unfolding, just on new stages and in new forms. Today's comedians walk a tightrope not unlike the one Tom and Dick were forced to navigate. Streaming giants replace television networks. Algorithms replace censors. But the pressure to conform, to tone it down, to avoid offense in the name of profitability or political comfort, that remains painfully familiar. In an age where cancel culture and corporate gatekeeping dictate what makes it to air, the Smothers Brothers' battle feels more like prophecy than history. Their story is more than a relic of the past, it's a warning. Because the moment we accept silence over satire, safety over truth, we start erasing the very heart of what comedy was meant to be. They taught us that laughter is never just noise. It's resistance, it's a declaration, and it's a risk. When networks punish honesty, when performers are told to just entertain, And when satire is sanitized to avoid discomfort, it isn't just the comedian who suffers, it's all of us. The Smothers brothers didn't just lose a show, they exposed the cost of creative courage, and that courage continues to echo through the voices of today's performers. From John Oliver's surgical breakdowns of hypocrisy to Sarah Silverman's unfiltered monologues, from Hassan Minhaj's fusion of humor and activism to Jon Stewart's searing interrogations of power, every one of them carries a trace of what Tom and Dick pioneered. In interviews, they've said it themselves. The Smothers brothers made it okay to care. They made it okay to be angry, to question, to mock not just for laughs, but for change. That's the resonance. That's the legacy. It's not about fame or airtime. It's about using whatever platform you have to speak when silence feels safer. Their story reminds us that television, comedy, and art are not just mirrors. They're megaphones. They can echo the culture, or they can challenge it. And when the world starts to fall in line with fear, those who choose to disrupt it, no matter the cost, become something more than entertainers. They become necessary, but their fight isn't over. It's on us now, on every viewer, every listener, every citizen with a voice and a choice, to demand stories that matter, to protect the spaces where truth can be told, and to never forget that what we laugh at reveals what we value. What we're willing to air or erase shapes who we are as a society. The Smothers brothers dared to ask, what happens when comedy refuses to obey? And the answer, decades later, still challenges us to respond not with fear, but with conviction. Because if they could risk everything for a single message, surely we can do our part to make sure that message lives on. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.